by product, customer, and company. Now, the first thing you need to do before you insert a pivot table is to make sure that your data is organized in a proper format. This means it should be in a tabular data format like you see here. Each column has a header. You shouldn't have empty columns in the middle, and you also shouldn't have empty rows in the middle of your dataset. Another thing you shouldn't have are total values in the middle of this dataset. Once you can check all these boxes, you're ready to insert your pivot table. To do that, you can go to Insert and select Pivot Table from here, but check this out. For the range, it's hard coding it to A3 until K108. This is until where I have data. If I add more lines to this, they will not be considered in my end report. I will have to update my range, and I'd rather avoid this step. So what I need to do before I insert a pivot table is to turn my dataset into an official Excel table. This has the added advantage that whenever I get new data added, my pivot tables will automatically reflect that the moment I press refresh. And all I have to do is click on this button here that's called Table, or use the shortcut key Control-T. Excel figures out that this table has headers. You can go with OK. And if this automatic table layout that Excel gives you bothers you, like it bothers me, you can go and remove it. Just select None. Now, what I also prefer to do is to give my table a name so that I can recognize it later on. You can do it from this table name box here. Now that we have a table, we can automatically summarize with a pivot table, or go back to Insert and click on Pivot Table. Check what happens now. We get the name of our table. As our table expands with new data, they will automatically be included in our pivot table. But before I do this, I want to show you even an easier way of inserting a pivot table, and that's to click on Recommended Pivot Tables. These are actually quite smart. They might just give you exactly what you're looking for, or they might help you get a faster start. So for example, here I have the sum of sales USD by customer name. One of the reports I want to create has sales USD in it. So I'm going to go with that. Just select it and click on OK. You get your pivot table inserted on a new sheet. This is the result of my table. It does all the aggregations for me. I didn't have to write a single formula to do this. Now on the side here, we get the pivot table fields. Now you can see I have them organized where the fields are on one side and the boxes that define the layout of my pivot table on the other side. That's an option you can select here. The default is the first one, field section that's stacked. Now if you want to have more space for your fields here, you can go and select field section and area section side by side. Now what you see here are all the headers of your dataset. That's why each column needs to have a header. What Excel went ahead and did when you inserted your pivot table is that it put the sales USD in the value section and customer name in the row section. Now, if for some reason you don't want to see the sum of sales USD, but instead you'd rather see something else, for example, the average, you can click on this drop down, go to Value Field Settings, and change your selection from here. So I go with average and OK. Now you can also change that from here. Right mouse click is your best friend on a pivot table. If I right mouse click, I can also select Value Field Settings from here. I'm going to put this to Sum and go with OK. Now another thing you can get to with a right mouse click is the number format. So let's say I want to add 1000 separator to my numbers here. I can select number format. So don't select format cells because that just formats the underlying cell. Number format stays with your pivot table as it expands. So I'm going to go with number, use 1000 separator, and 0 decimal places. Now you can adjust and update this pivot table as you see fit. So for example, if I wanted to look at the different regions, I could decide to add the region in the filter, and then when I click on this drop down, I can select a specific region, or I can activate multi-select, which in this case doesn't really make sense because I just have 2 items, and you can also leave it on all. Now if you decide that you don't want to have region in the filter, you can bring it to the column section. And now we have customer name by region here. we also automatically get the grand totals on the side. Now, if you have another level, so let's say we're going to bring product description to the rows here, we also get subtotals. Now, here's where you might want to update the design of your pivot table. So for example, under grand totals, you might decide to deactivate it for either the rows or the columns, or for everything if you don't want to see it at all. So if I go with off, it completely removes my grand totals. If I just activate it for columns only, I get the grand total on the bottom here. Now you might also want to do the same thing for subtotals. If I select do not show subtotals, it's going to remove them from here. Now, as for the layout of your report, the layout that I personally prefer is to show in a tabular form. This gives me column headers for each of the fields here. Now, another thing you might want to do is to fill in the gaps here. Under report layout, you could select repeat all item labels, and that repeats everything and fills in the gaps. Now I'm just going to remove that. And now let's take a look at the button here. So you have the ability to collapse fields or expand fields. If you want to take away this ability, you can go to Pivot Table Analyze and under Show, click on this toggle here and it takes away the buttons. If you click again, it brings them back. Now the field list is this one here. If for some reason you close that and you want to get it back, you can do that by going back to Show and selecting the fields list from here. Now I'm just going to put everything back to the way I had it. So I don't want region. Whenever you don't want something, you can just kick it out, just drag and drop it here somewhere in the fields list. I also don't want the product description. So I just want customer name by sales USD. One other thing you might want to do is to update the header here. So I don't want anyone to see sum of sales USD. Let's say I just want them to see sales USD. When I press enter, Excel doesn't like it if a header here is identical to a field name here. So if you want it to be identical, what you need to do is either add a space after the name or before the name. Or you can completely change the name. So we could just call this sales instead of sales USD. Also for grand total, I can just call this total. Okay, so let's also update the design of this pivot table by selecting a different style. So you have a lot of options here, and you even have the ability to create your own pivot table style if you'd like. Now, one thing I'd like to do here is to sort this. So just right mouse click, sort largest to smallest. Now notice that the pivot table columns collapse. There is an option for this. You can actually remove autofit if you don't want this to happen. So right mouse click, go to pivot table options. On the bottom here, you have autofit column width on update. Let's take away that check mark and go with OK. Now, one thing I originally wanted was to get the sales percentage by customer as compared with the total. And let's say I also want to see the complete sales values here. Well, what I can do is to bring in the sales USD a second time into my values field. But now check this out. I'm going to right mouse click, show values as, and select percent of grand total. But check out all the other options that you have. If you get a chance, go ahead and try these because they can come in handy when you're creating reports. Now I'm going to call this sales percentage. Okay, so our first report is done. Before we test whether this updates properly if we add new data to our table, let's go ahead and create our second pivot table. The way I personally prefer to do that is to copy an existing pivot table, go to the side and paste it in, and then adjust what I need. This gives me a head start because the pivot table formatting comes with. So in this second report, I don't need the sales percentage. What I want is the product by sales, and I want it sorted. So let's right mouse click, sort largest to smallest. Okay, so my pivot tables are actually done, but I just want to show you one thing before we wrap up, and that's how easy it is to add slicer buttons to your pivot table. So for example, let's say for region, instead of having it in the filter here and selecting from a drop down, what we could do is add it as a slicer. So while it's in the field list, you can right mouse click and add as slicer. And it adds these buttons here that you can organize anywhere you want. And when you click on it, it filters your report to show the values in your slicer. Now, for your slicer, you also get slicer options here, so you can update the design for this. You can also update how you want it shown by adjusting the number of columns, the height, and the width of your slicer. Now, if you insert a slicer and you want to connect it to another pivot table, you just have to go to the pivot table that doesn't have that slicer, go to Pivot Table Analyze, under Filter Connections, place a check mark for the slicer. This is our region slicer, so when I click on OK, this one is also connected to my new slicer. In case you want to select all regions, you can activate multi-select here, or you just hold down Control while you make your selection. Okay, so as a last step, we're just going to make sure that everything updates automatically the moment we get new data in here. So I'm just going to expand this. Let's add a new product. Let's also add a new customer. Now let's go back to our pivot table reports, and all we have to do is pick any of these pivot tables, right mouse click and refresh. Because they have the same pivot cache, they're all going to update automatically together. We can see the new customer added here and our new product added in the middle because we have our sales data sorted in descending order. Okay, so this is how easy it is to create pivot tables in Excel.